Welcome into the 24/7 Sports Football Recruiting Podcast. My name is Blair Angulo. Thank you so much for tuning in. It is Friday, August 19th. Remember to like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel as we continue our charge towards the college football season. And to do so today, we've got National Recruiting Editor Brandon Huffman of 24/7 Sports to break down the top 5 uncommitted players in the West region. Huff, we're resetting the board in a way. I think a lot of activity has happened this summer, obviously with the official visits and a lot of commitments, a lot of the top players coming off the board. But now I think the attention turns to some of those big names. We're going to talk Matteo Uiagalelei from St. John Bosco, the 5-star defensive lineman who also plays some tight end there in the Southern California powerhouse. We're going to talk Deuce Robinson, the number 1 tight end in the country from the state of Arizona. 2 players from the state of Utah, the top 2 rated players, Akana and Spencer Fano, and then we're going to round it out with Roderick Pleasant, the speedy cornerback from Gardena Serra, also in Southern California. But Huff, before we get there, how are you doing? How was your trip to Nashville?
Hey, the trip to Nashville was productive. It was efficient. It was great. It was enjoyable. And frankly, I was surprised that I wasn't as hot there as I was when I got home to Seattle, which is going under a mini heat wave this week. When I got to the airport and I was walking to my car, my goodness, I was cooler when I was in Nashville wearing jeans and a long sleeve shirt. So, hey, it's that 5 week of summer that Seattle gets every year by people come up here and get suckered into moving up here and end up living here long term, like me 18 years ago.
Yeah. Are you regretting that?
Oh, I've been regretting it since 18 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of those things where I think we're so well traveled in a way that we get a sense of different climates. Stepping out of that plane in Nashville this last week, I was with Greg Biggins. We were on those same flights out of Southern California, and you did get a sense of the humidity, but it wasn't as hot as it is out here. So that's something that a lot of these recruits are going to start to experience as it takes some official visits, especially down south, especially to other time zones. And let's kick off with one of them that is going to be hitting the road to maybe potentially get his final things in order, check some final boxes as it relates to his college contenders. Matteo Uiagalelei, very familiar with the recruiting process. His brother DJ, the quarterback at Clemson, obviously went through the process a few years ago, and he's been well-traveled as well. He's been out on the road. He's been able to see some of the schools that are high on his recruiting list. What's the latest that we've been able to gather on Matteo Uiagalelei as he continues to narrow his recruiting focus?
Yeah, it's interesting. When you look at DJ's recruitment, he wrapped his up in April of his junior year so he could have his senior year free from having to worry about the recruiting process. Matteo, a much quieter person, even, a lower profile on social media in comparison to DJ, but yet his recruitment is continuing to go. Right now, it looks like there's 3 schools that are kind of out front, and that would be Ohio State, Oregon, and USC. Alabama has been working to try to get a visit from him. They've been trying to stay in the race for Matteo, but it just hasn't happened. Now, that may be a visit he takes this fall, and then I think if that ends up happening, then you absolutely have to take Alabama into serious consideration in this. A friend of his, Raymond Polito, who actually transferred to Bosco for a few months, went back home to Apple Valley, just committed to Alabama over the weekend. But right now, it looks like Ohio State, Oregon, and USC are kind of standing out front. Now, Blair, you and I have talked about this on West of the Rest. We've already seen Los Angeles go to the Big Ten this year with USC and UCLA's decision to leave the Pac-12 for the Big Ten. Could Matteo be greeting USC and UCLA in the Big Ten? Ohio State is certainly hoping so. Obviously, Larry Johnson's development of defensive linemen, of pass rushers. You go back to the Bosa twins, Chase Young. There's been a number of elite pass rushers. And even right now, you got 2 sophomores in Jack Sawyer and, of course, JT Tuimoloau, who was, for the majority of the 2021 recruiting cycle, the number 1 player in the country per 24/7 Sports, who could have also been an elite tight end, much like Matteo. So Ohio State's still trying. Obviously, Oregon really tried. They were down there, down the stretch for DJ. ultimately saw him go to Clemson, and then the hometown school USC, which they seem to prioritize Bryce Young over DJ. Maybe if DJ ends up staying in Southern California, Matteo's already committed there. But right now, Oregon, Ohio State, and USC seem to have been taking kind of the lead. And very interestingly enough, we mentioned Alabama there. If you go back to JT Tuimoloau's recruitment, those 4 schools were all involved, as well as hometown Washington in his case. But all 3 of those schools, Ohio State, Oregon, USC, all have different reasons for why they could be considered a very strong contender. So I think there's still going to be a couple more twists and turns there in Matteo's recruitment. Obviously, Alabama, if they can get a visit, that's going to be a big kind of wrench thrown into those other 3 schools' plans of just having to try to fight against each other.
It's interesting that Clemson has never really been in the picture for Matteo Uiagalelei, and then I'm not sure what to read into that. Obviously, he's his own person, but I would have assumed that Clemson, having already taken one, would want to get the brother as well, considering his upside as well, right? He's number 8 overall nationally in the 24/7 Sports rankings, the number 2 edge-rated pass rusher in the class, number 3 among players in the state of California. Really, really big kid, about 265, 270 at about 6'5". So a lot to like there. But I think Matteo, in a way, early on in his process, always said he's going to be able to do things independently of his brother. He's going to, take his looks and his options and really assess everything. And I think he's been to Ohio State a number of times. Locally, USC's been able to get him on campus a few times. Oregon, never really count them out for a top tier prospect out west. But when I look at that list of 3 schools, the school that I think has the most to lose there in terms of like they need Matteo the most, that would be USC, right? Like Lincoln Riley, this is his first true recruiting class. The top player at one of the better schools here locally in Southern California. This is his opportunity to make a statement.
Yeah, I mean, you look at what happened when Lincoln Riley got the job last year. Damani Jackson had just opened up his recruitment. He was a longtime commit to USC. He opened it up to USC and to Alabama, was ultimately able to keep him in the fold. Didn't get a David Bailey, was able to flip in the next class, Malachi Nelson and Makai Lemon. But Matteo is much bigger than just the football player. I mean, that's a momentum type of recruit. And we've seen some players in the Southland again this year having no problem leaving the region. We're seeing, I mean, the whole reason we started West of the Rest a couple of years ago is because of how many guys from the Pac-12 footprint were leaving the region. Now, Oregon's trying to have something to say about that, trying to keep them there. But if you're USC and you're going to be playing in the Big Ten in 2 years from now, you need big athletic defensive linemen. You need big athletic offensive linemen to be able to make that seamless transition. You also don't want to lose guys in your own backyard. And, one of the things that's been talked about a bunch since the decision by SC and UCLA to go to the Big Ten is, what is this going to do for recruiting the Southland? Is this going to make it even easier for Big Ten schools to come into Southern California and now recruit those guys? Is it going to make it more difficult for USC and UCLA to keep the local kids home? You don't want to lose a year and a half, 2 years before you make that move. You don't want to lose a Los Angeles kid playing at St. John Bosco, one of the schools that you're going to recruit, you're going to set up camp at year after year. You don't want to lose them to another Big Ten school. It's almost like you could handle losing him to Oregon if you're USC because they're not going to be in the Pac-12 with you in 2 years from now. But you don't want to give the Big Ten, which last we checked in the Rose Bowl, CJ Stroud, who grew up, 30 miles from USC, was setting records. You don't want to keep losing. Look at that. I mean, you go back to that Rose Bowl, how many West Coast players were making plays for Ohio State in that game? In the year before, in the Sugar Bowl when they beat Clemson, you had, Emeka Egbuka, who was the 4th receiver, comes in with the 2 top receivers out, one of them being a San Diego kid and Chris Olave. He comes in, has the best game of his career. You have JT Tuimoloau, who's holding on to Cameron Rising's legs as he gets sacked and knocked out of the game. You have what CJ Stroud did. You have West Coast kids playing in the Rose Bowl, playing for a Big Ten school. So you don't want that floodgate to be thrown open even more. That's why Matteo Uiagalelei is such an important recruit to USC and to momentum. And we look and see how loaded the Bosco roster is. There's 40-plus players already with scholarships. You want to keep recruiting there. keep those elite players home, and that makes it easier to recruit there down the line.
Yeah, it could be a really interesting case study to what could potentially be maybe a trend for Lincoln Riley. And I think the on-field results will matter a lot there as USC shifts not only its tenure in terms of the coaching, but also maybe its stylistic and the way they look in terms of an attractiveness to college football recruits. From one player that USC really needs in this class to one that they look really, really good for, and that would be the number one tight end in the class. Deuce Robinson out of Pinnacle High School in North Phoenix, Arizona, 6'6", 225, number 29 nationally in the 24/7 Sports rankings. Already took his official visit to USC. So if I'm a Trojans fan, that's possibly my only worry is that they've already had him on campus. He's still scheduled to take at least 3 more. Louisville's also in the mix there, could get an official visit. Texas, he'll be there for the Alabama game, September 10th. Then he'll be at Georgia 2 weeks later for his official visit there. Never count out the Bulldogs for a top-tier tight end. And then he'll round out his officials with Alabama on October 8th. That's what's scheduled so far. And I think, like I mentioned, USC has been looking really good there. They're certainly in the driver's seat. I think he's struck a really good relationship with Zachariah Brents, the number 1 receiver who's committed there, struck a relationship with Malachi Nelson, although it still looks a little, interesting with Malachi Nelson having taken an official visit to Texas A&M in late July. What's your vibe? What's your feel on what potentially could be a big few months here for Deuce Robinson?
Well, if you look at the momentum that Louisville has built in recruiting in this cycle with players like DeAndre Moore, with Aaron Williams, Ruben Owens, obviously Pierce Clarkson, kind of the ringleader, the Pied Piper effect. Well, then they get Deuce Robinson to go out in July. I think there's obviously reason to think, hey, Louisville might not be messing around here. But there has been such a long draw to USC. People forget his dad, Dom Robinson, former Diamond Bar High School star, went on to play at Florida State. He was recruited by USC, but back when he was in high school, Paul Hackett was still the head coach at USC. They were kind of going through up and down seasons, and he went to Florida State. Now, 20 plus years later, Deuce is going through the process. USC is very attractive. He's already had a relationship with Malachi Nelson and Mekhi Lemon. Early in the spring, there was a lot of buzz that those 3 guys would play together. Maybe Malachi Nelson's trip to Texas A&M has him thinking, maybe I should look at all other options. But I still think USC is going to be a factor there. You look at USC's tight end recruiting this year. They've already got a commitment from Cade Eldridge out of Linden, Washington, Linden Christian, my wife's alma mater, going down to play at USC. But Walker Lyons, a guy that they looked like they were going to, probably be in the top 2 or 3 for, ended up committing to Stanford. There's a part of me that wonders, does that mean that there was a little bit more understanding on his part? Hey, they already got Eldridge coming in. Lyons is ranked higher than Eldridge. Lyons is going on an LDS mission, so he's going to miss a year. But does the Deuce Robinson factor make it seem like, hey, USC is going to be okay at the tight end position, even losing Lyons? And I got to think that USC is still going to be a prominent part of that recruitment down the stretch. I know, Blair, you got out to go see him during the spring. You got a chance to see him at the Elite 11 where he was one of the pass catchers. And in fact, he was at the Elite 11 a year ago and at the opening invitational where he catapulted into the number 1 tight end in the country. But it looks like he's only gotten better since then.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback off of your point, Walker Lyons and Deuce Robinson were in LA for their official visits the same weekend. So maybe a little wink action there between the 2 tight ends. Really interesting dynamic. But yeah, this is a player who continues to improve, continues to make strides as a football player, multi-sport star who actually spent a week down in San Diego earlier this summer at the area code baseball game. So this is an invite-only elite, baseball event where, scouts are down there, college coaches are down there. It's the who's who of high school baseball. And so this is a player who also has his options out in front of him in terms of being able to be a 2-sport star. I had a little birdie tell me that it sounds like he's more of a football guy right now. He's maybe a bit ahead of where he is as a baseball player, but make no question about it, this is a player that's going to give it a shot. He's going to try to play both sports, and that's what makes it interesting with his list, right? Georgia's a really good baseball program. USC, maybe not so much, but traditionally has been known as a baseball school as well. Alabama, Texas, all those schools have some decent baseball programs. Louisville, churning out first-round draft picks every year. So
And this may
those are.
not mean this may mean something, it may mean nothing. But USC's new baseball coach, where did he just come from? Grand Canyon University in Phoenix, Arizona. So I guarantee you that Andy Stankovich, the former MLB player, is very familiar with Deuce and his baseball playing ability, especially with Grand Canyon being one of the better non-major programs out west.
Yeah. So that's one of the factors that I always look at with Deuce Robinson is, how big of a baseball mindset does he have heading into college? I know he wants to play both sports, but what's the relationship like with some of these schools? So that's going to be interesting to monitor here the next couple months as he takes some official visits. But that's the latest on Deuce Robinson. And let's continue, Huff, our conversation on the West Coast. Two players from the state of Utah, Spencer Fano, Tausili Akana, have yet to make their decisions. They will be taking official visits. Let's begin with Tausili Akana. He is the number one edge rusher in the region, a player with tremendous upside, originally from the state of Hawaii. We spoke about him earlier this week on the West of the Rest podcast in terms of his official visits. And he's got a really busy itinerary. I don't know if anyone's logged as many miles as Tausili Akana.
Well, I don't. The only one who would have been his dad, Brandon, who's still flying from Hawaii, where he's the head basketball coach at Kahuku High School. He's got to go those extra 3,000 miles just to get to the mainland.
Yeah. And he was there for his season opener last Friday, so he's got official visits lined up with Texas. He will also be there for the Alabama game on September 10th. Then after that, he's got two more set in October: LSU October 7th, Oklahoma October 14th, and then Texas A&M will get an official visit November 4th. The other schools that are potentially pushing for that fifth and final official visit: Tennessee and Oregon. So he's got an SEC flavor. We hinted it, we suggested it. It looks like Tausili Akana will be playing his football in the SEC unless Oregon's able to kind of pull off a shocker in a way there. But this is, I think, one of those interesting battles where he's gathered a ton of info. He's been able to get a lot of information. He's been able to really, I think, weigh the options and, figure out what he likes, what he doesn't like. And for him to settle on these schools is pretty significant. I don't know if a game day atmosphere is going to win him over because, like I said, he's done his research. But I think relationships, I think, a potential NIL deal, all this sort of stuff these are factors for him.
And granted, they were in different sports, but his two older sisters were both recruited to play volleyball. In fact, one of his sisters just transferred from Nebraska to now go to Texas, where they also have a commitment to the Texas football side from Leona Lefau, who's another one of his good friends, his former teammate at Kahuku. But you mentioned it, relationships. So he's been to these towns. He's been on unofficial visits. He's been to these schools throughout the process for himself, for his sisters. He knows what these schools offer. He knows what these towns offer. And that's where the relationship aspect is so clutch and it's so key. And that's what's going to be something that may work in Texas's favor. He's got a great relationship with Pete Kwiatkowski, the defensive coordinator there, who also has recruited, the West extensively from his time at the University of Washington. Obviously, Steve Sarkisian has had tremendous success out West, going back to when he was an assistant coach at USC to then being the head coach at Washington SC and offensive coordinator at Alabama, and now at Texas. Then you have Leona. Then you have his sister. There's a lot of factors that make Texas seem like they could be a favorite here, but those aren't just the obvious things that a guy like Tausili is going to, fall under the spell of. He is going to do his homework. He's been doing his homework extensively, and that's why those visits these fall are so crucial to his recruitment.
Yeah, he told me he will be taking all of his official visits before he makes a decision. So he's definitely one that will be getting a lot of headlines here in the next couple months. Spencer Fano has already taken one official visit. He's the number one rated offensive lineman in the West region from Tint View High School in Provo, 6'5", 270. Makes it look easy. He's so refined technique-wise, but he's got a nasty streak that you really like as well. He's going to take the visits, he told me. He wants to be able to get out to some schools. Michigan, which he already went to unofficially, will get an official visit. He'll be there for the Michigan State game. But, the interesting thing there is that he's also considering Michigan State. So it'll be an opportunity for him to knock out 2 schools on one trip and potentially look at how Michigan State sets up along the offensive line. Another school he wants to take an official to is Oregon. That will happen sometime in the months of September or October. He's potentially looking at the BYU game for that Oregon trip. And he's got a tremendous relationship with Adrian Clem, who used to coach his close. He used to coach his one of his close friends in terms of the coaching circles and the training circles. That would be Xavier Su'a-Filo at UCLA. And then he's trying to figure out what he's going to do with the other official visits. USC is in there. Miami is in there, which was recruiting him really heavily with the previous staff being at Oregon, Mario Cristobal and Alex Mirabal. And, if I had to wager, I would have said Oregon was going to land him when Mario Cristobal was there. So it'll be interesting to see if they're able to draw him across the country to go take an official visit to Miami. Penn State's involved, USC, UCLA. These are all schools that are pushing there. BYU still has the crystal ball predictions, but I feel less and less confident that that's where he'll end up. His brother Logan plays there. It's right down the street from Tintview. And, I'm looking at the situation, and I think the more and more it's dragged on and the more time he's taken, I think the more likely it happens that he potentially leaves the region, Huff.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you mentioned this before, but his LDS mission plans, we talked about Walker Lyons taking his immediately. Aren't his plans very similar to Xavier Su'a-Filo, where he plans to go play a year and then go serve his mission? Or have his plans been adjusted at all by recruiting? Because it doesn't seem like any of the schools are worried about. There's a lot of schools that will back off a recruit if he plans to take his LDS mission early in his career or before he starts his career. But judging by the schools recruiting him, the LDS mission may not be as prominent on the front end. But what's the latest that? Because I think that could also have a bearing on who he picks, on where he goes.
Yeah, so from what I've gathered, Spencer Fano does want to take a mission at some point, but it won't happen immediately. He will enroll early. He'll sign in December. He'll get to whatever college he picks right after the All-American Bowl. Then he'll take a week off to go to the Polynesian Bowl in Hawaii. So all this will happen in the month of January. Then he'll be on a college campus for his freshman season. And then he'll make a decision, right? And that's what Xavier Su'a-Filo was able to do at UCLA. I think he's been able to, pick his brain a little bit about what that process will like. And, I'm not ruling out no mission either. I think this is a player who I think will make a decision closer to when he has to. And like you mentioned, I think this affects recruitments more so than we tend to think or tend to talk about. But it hasn't really affected his recruitment. These are all heavy hitters going after Spencer Fano. Let's wrap up the top 5 uncommitted in the West region with Roderick Pleasant. He is maybe the fastest recruit in the West. Would you say, Huff? I mean, he's one of the better, one of the better players nationally. On the perimeter where he's able to match up one-on-one and has been a track star nationally. I know here for the last year and a half. What's the latest on his football recruitment?
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate the track side of it, I believe he's the first junior since Kalfani Muhammad at Notre Dame High School, who ultimately played at Cal, to win the 100-meter and 200-meter state titles in the state of California. So we know that the speed is there. He's already set a goal of either hitting the 10-second mark or breaking 10 seconds his senior year, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if he did that. Oregon is a school that is on his list. They're going to get one of his last scheduled official visits during the season. He already took an official visit to Boston College back in June, which was kind of I don't want to say a random school, but Jeff Hafley coming out to the West Coast and getting Pleasant to visit. They actually got a couple of guys from the West Coast to take a visit. But then you have the official visit to Cal coming up in October, and then you have the official visit to Oregon in November. USC is all but a lock to get an official visit, whether it's during the season, whether it's after the season. They're going to get an official from him. So then it comes down to Penn State and UCLA to see who gets that 5th and final visit. He named a top 6 that included Boston College and Penn State. Then it was USC, UCLA, Oregon, and Cal as well. So, maybe he goes to the ACC with Boston College. Maybe he goes to the Big Ten with Penn State and soon to be Big Ten schools, USC and UCLA. Maybe he stays in the Pac-12 footprint. But this is one, Blair, you and I have been covering recruiting a long time together. When we see speedy DBs from Gardena, Sarah, where do they usually end up?
Usually, right? I mean,
Usually.
I'm getting a Dory Jackson flashbacks.
Yes.
I'm getting, this is a player who I think understands his value, and there's no need to make a decision. But I think we've always felt that USC was the leader in the clubhouse. They need playmakers on the defensive side of the ball. They need the speed on the perimeter. We've seen it the last few years, especially under Clay Helton and whatever we want to call that defense that Dante Williams was running out there last year. This is a team that needs guys that make plays. They had maybe one or two, but when you think about the great USC teams, they had 5, 6 dudes on every level that were making plays. This is a player who's going to be able to blanket one side of the field. I think he's still developing and he's still raw, and as you would expect from a track star that spends half of his time and half of his energy focusing on getting faster linearly. From a linear standpoint, is linearly a word?
It works for me.
We'll go with it. But from a straight line speed, this is a player who has it all, right? And he's still developing. So I think he's right now. You have to feel good about USC and where they stand with him and his recruitment. But like I said with Deuce, and like I said with Matteo Uiagalelei to kick off this podcast, I think it will matter how USC looks, at least early on in the season. If they're able to get off to a really good start, watch out, because the USC recruiting machine will then get going once again. Huff, anything else before we go?
Yeah, I just, to kind of piggyback on that, the one thing USC also doesn't have to worry about is they don't have to worry about UC Regents trying to block their move to the Big Ten. USC knows they're going to the Big Ten in 2024. Adding a player like a Roderick Pleasant or a Deuce Robinson or some of the other guys that they're after, Matteo, those are the kind of players that they are going to need to be able to not just compete in the Big Ten, but if their desire with Lincoln Riley's hiring is to compete for national championships, you got to get past those teams that have been winning Big Ten championships in recent years, namely Ohio State. So you can't be losing recruiting battles to Ohio State. But when we've seen Ohio State these last few years, what's been so impressive, and this goes back to the Urban Meyer era, was how well he was able to recruit speedy players and how much of an emphasis, obviously his time being at Florida, he knew the importance of speed. USC, with a guy like Roderick Pleasant, that's the kind of speed they're going to need with some of those bigger, faster receivers at the Big Ten. Blair, I grew up going to the Rose Bowl in the 80s and the 90s when it was the speed and athleticism of the Pac-12 against the big guys from the Big Ten. That has changed. The Big Ten is not just a big power conference. There's plenty of speed there. So that means a guy like a Roderick Pleasant, that's the kind of guy that USC, they don't want to lose a pipeline school like they did, for a couple of times there with Mater Dei when they lost to Bryce Young. They want to keep that pipeline to Sarah that they've had for a long time, but they also don't have to worry about any UC Regents trying to say, hey, you can't go. USC in 2 years from now, they're not just saying fight on, they're saying peace out, Pac-12.
Wow, that's a double dandy right there with the hand usage. Brandon, pleasure as always. Can't wait to do it again.
Anytime, Blair.
That is the national recruiting editor for 24/7 Sports, Brandon Huffman. You can follow him on Twitter at Brandon Huffman. We will continue our conversation on the top 5 uncommitted players in every region. So remember, you check back in to this podcast feed, like the video, subscribe to the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel. For Brandon Huffman, I am Blair Angulo. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the 24/7 Sports Football Recruiting Podcast.